Hello, everyone. On the keynote from yesterday, which definitely took all of us down a memory lane, Jacqueline Knowles talked about how you can improve your Shiny apps if you just understand that Shiny's job is pretty much to create HTML for the page, and how you can customize Shiny a lot if you were free to tweak the HTML yourself. Up next is a tutorial to show you just how to do that. How to Build Custom Bootstrap Cards with Shiny by Michael Thomas, who's the chief data scientist at Ketchbrook Analytics, who apparently has had his fair share of Power BI years, like some of us. This is going to be a pre-recorded tutorial, and now we enjoy the tutorial.
Hello, my name is Michael Thomas. I am the Chief Data Scientist at Ketchbrook Analytics, coming to you today from the Hartford, Connecticut area in the USA. And I'm going to be providing a tutorial today on building custom Bootstrap cards in Shiny, with our goal being to take a chunk of HTML and CSS code that we see and re-implement that in Shiny code. So let's get started. First of all, what is this thing called Bootstrap? Bootstrap is a suite of CSS and JavaScript tools, many of which are already used in Shiny. Some of these components might look familiar. We're going to show a few of these Bootstrap components that we have access to. In particular, you might recognize the alerts that we have access to, which look a lot like what we get when we run the show notification function in Shiny. Here we have all of these nice different colored alerts, and we know that if we call Shiny show notification, we'll get something that looks exactly like this, and in Bootstrap that's just called an alert. Some of these components, right, look familiar, but others might not, and I'm going to show you one today called a card, a Bootstrap card, and we can scroll way down to take a look at what examples of these really pretty Bootstrap cards look like. They have a nice header, they have kind of this larger font card title, and then they have some smaller font here. We know that there are other tangential packages to Shiny that try to accomplish the same thing, but today we really want to take this exact card that we have on the page here on our Bootstrap website at getbootstrap.com and try to re-implement this right within Shiny. Just so you know, this is Bootstrap version 5 that we're looking at. So we want to make sure that we are using Bootstrap version 5 in Shiny as well. So let's start with this nice little Shiny app that we have. You can see it's only 38 small lines of code. We're using 3 libraries, Shiny of course, the glue package for some text concatenation that'll make our lives easier when we start building our functions, and lastly the BSLib package, which allows us to specify the version of Bootstrap that we want to use within this BS theme function. So a really easy way to make sure that we have a direct mapping to what we're looking at on this Bootstrap website to what we're building in our Shiny app. So I can actually run this little shell app, and all we have, as you'll note, is UI code. We're just going to be working within the UI, nothing on the server side today. And we can render that right in our viewer here. And we'll see that we have a little header. It says building custom Bootstrap cards with Shiny. We have our little H3 title. Card 1 goes here just as a placeholder. And then we have this empty function called BS card, which is the function that we are going to fill right here next. So if we take a look in this function itself, we have a little note for us about where exactly we got these cards. So this is the URL that we were just looking at here. And then we have this chunk of HTML that we also got from the Bootstrap website. So for each of these cards that we're seeing on the Bootstrap website, we actually have all of the different little HTML chunks. So you'll see this one says primary card title right here. We're using the primary background status, and that ties to this first card here. And the second one is secondary. And then we'll see that this next little HTML chunk here uses that secondary Bootstrap style. So all we really need is this first chunk to make one of these cards, because we're just going to try to recreate one of these cards. And that's what we've pasted right back into the comments right above our BS card function that we are going to create. So one way that we could implement this is just really copying and pasting the HTML code verbatim and putting it in Shiny's nice HTML function that we have access to. So we could do something like this, where we're just kind of quoting all of this HTML. Put it right in this function here. We'll have to escape the quotes that are HTML quotes, so we can do that easily with a little Control F. Find replace all. And if we requote this and we actually run our function, we'll actually get that exact card that we were just looking at on the Bootstrap webpage, right? We have our header, we have our title, and we have some quick example text right in here. That's an easy way to quickly take this chunk of HTML and CSS code that's right here and directly plug that right into a Shiny function. But if you look at this right here, this is pretty hard for somebody who's not familiar with HTML and CSS to debug or modify if they want to make changes to it. We want our code to be a lot more legible and friendly for our users who might want to edit this later and who we might be handing this off to. Be more comfortable editing our code than a giant chunk of HTML code. So we are going to make use of all of the awesome native functions available in Shiny that spit out these ugly chunks of HTML for us. And what am I talking about here? So if we first look at kind of the beginning of this HTML here, we notice that we have this thing called a div that appears all the time. And that is native in the Shiny div function itself. And div is kind of the root unit that you would wrap an HTML or anything that you would see on a website, any sort of component in. So we can run this just Shiny div, and it's just an empty function. We won't even put anything in it for now. And if we just run that in the console, it spits out something that looks a heck of a lot like what we are just looking at here in our HTML. We have a div at the start here, and then we have this / div at the end, and we see that that appears kind of at the end of this whole big chunk of HTML that we were looking at. And we can do the same exact thing in our console with some other functions. Like let's try that Shiny H3 for that kind of third large font size header. We can just write hello world. And if we run that in the console as opposed to running it in our Shiny app, it's just going to spit out this nice little chunk of HTML code that is what actually renders on the web page when we run our Shiny app. And we can see that we have our text here wrapped by these H3 tags. So really cool that we have the ability to render kind of and look at what's under the hood of Shiny right in our console. So let's look at the very first line of that HTML chunk and try to replicate it using Shiny code. We'll do it just in our console for now. So if we get rid of everything that was in here, we know that we're probably going to need this Shiny div function because we're starting out with a div. And we can literally copy this first section, which is the class argument in our div. And this tells us, in this component, what kind of component do we want it to be? We want it to be a card. What is the color of the text? Well, we want that to be white. What is the background? It's that primary blue status. And this last little piece, MB3, has to do with the size of the card. So that's our first argument, is the class. And just about every function that we have access to in Shiny has this class and these style arguments as well. You may not be using them very often unless you do want to customize the look and feel other than what you get sort of out of the box in the Shiny components. And again, this second argument is the style argument. So we have style equals the max width, which is 18. And that essentially tells us as we dynamically make the page wider or smaller, what is the largest that we would want this card to actually get to? You know, as we drag the page wider, when do we want the width of the card that we're creating to stop? So we can run this right now. We'll just take this first line that we have, and we can actually run our app because we know that we have this function hanging out over here. So any modifications that we do to our BS card function will get picked up in our app. So we can run this again and take a look and see what we get. So we can see that we have the very, very top of the card there. We have that blue background color that we saw on our Bootstrap webpage right up here, this primary card, but we didn't give it any content yet. So what we need to do is we have to try to at least first add the header content to the card. So let's carefully look at the second line in our commented out HTML code that we brought in. So if we take a look at that, we have a div at the very beginning of our first line. And if you remember, when we're running all of these HTML sort of functions in our console, they're wrapped. They wrap their content with a start and an end here. So we have a div here at the beginning, but at the end of the line, that same line 9, we don't have that. So actually everything is wrapped, everything is nested sort of within this first function. So as we go to add our second div, which is the card header, that we're going to put at the header of our card, the top of our card, we're going to actually do that within our first div function. And notice that this one, on this second line, we have a div at the beginning, and that gets closed out at the end, on the back end here. So we'll grab this, and we'll have to add another div, and we can do that again with our Shiny div function. We'll use the class equals card header. We'll take that straight from the HTML that we saw on our Bootstrap web page, and on the Bootstrap web page, I think they just use header, right? That's what they're using actually as the text, which is a little confusing, but we'll just keep that for now, and we'll show how to modify that later. So we'll just say header. And we can close our parenthesis because we know that this is getting closed out here. So actually, if we just ran this little piece right here in our console, we would get div class card header, header, div, and that looks exactly like what we have on line 2, which is exactly what we're trying to replicate. We want verbatim what we see on the Bootstrap component web page to be what we get in our Shiny app without having to write code that's quite as ugly as what we're seeing in this HTML. So we can rerun this app again and see if we bring in our header. Awesome, we have this header here in the white font that looks exactly like what we saw on the Bootstrap website. Now our card is starting to come together. So next we need to keep adding the rest of the card's content. So on our next line here, we start another div, and this one is called card body. That's the type of component that we're creating next. That's what this div is going to be. So we can start that here, and remember we can close our parenthesis because we had a beginning and an end to this last, our card header div, and we'll create a new div here, and we'll say class equals card body. We'll take that straight from what we saw on the Bootstrap web page. And what's going to be within this card body? Well, first we have an H5 tag, and we know that that means sort of a title. And H1 is really large, H2 is a little smaller, H3 is a little smaller than that, all the way to H6. So H5 is pretty small, but a little bit bigger than your regular font that you would see on the page. So that's what we're going to use to wrap our card title in. So we can put that within this div here. We can go Shiny, H, and we see we have all of these different H functions, H1 through H5, like we just talked about. For our purposes, we're going to be using H5. We'll open that up, and we will add the class under H5 that we want, and that's our card title. So the next thing that we are adding is going to be what we see here in primary card title. That's what we're going to be replicating. And all we're grabbing out of that is the actual text itself. which in this case is a little silly. Again, we're saying the text that we want to show on our card is primary card title. And we know that we can close our parenthesis around that H5 function because it gets closed out here at the end. It's wrapped around that primary card title. So there we go. The next thing that goes within our card body is a P tag, which we know is just sort of regular text that you would see in Shiny. So we can add that here after our H5. We'll say Shiny P. And the class is card text here. So if you're following along with all of the different classes of these components, our first class was just card. Our second class was card header. Our third class was card body. Our fourth class was card title. And the last sort of component to these cards is the card text element of this component. So class equals card text, and the text that we're using is just some quick example text. So we will add that here. We can close our parenthesis because our P tag is getting closed as well. And then it looks like the rest of our parens for our two divs at the beginning of this function are all set to go and are already in place for us at the end. So we can rerun this function and see what we get in our app. So cool. We now have a card that looks exactly like what we saw on the Bootstrap website. And of course we want to be able to modify this though, right? So instead of sort of having all of this hard-coded right here, the purpose of creating a function like any R function is to be able to dynamically modify it in a really easy, quick way on the fly within our app. So let's start adding some of the some arguments for the things that we might want to modify on the fly. So the first thing that I can think of wanting to modify would be the font color. So what we're looking at right now is white font color, and maybe we want that to be black. So let's add a argument to our function here called font color. And what we can do is take advantage of that glue package that we had brought in within our app, and that allows us to really easily paste these strings together and use our arguments that we pass to our functions. And we can wrap those arguments in curly brackets, and now we can replace what we previously had. So we had text white, which means the font color was going to be white, and we'll replace that white with whatever font color we want to provide in our argument. So let's go back to our app, and let's add that argument for font color, and let's say we want to pass it black. We can reload our app, and wow, now we have the same card, but we really quickly were able to change the font color here from white to black. So it looks like our first argument that will allow us to create a bunch of these cards sort of on the fly in our app is working great. Maybe the second argument that we might want to add to this function is the background color, right? So I'll call that BG color for the next argument. And we know that that gets taken care of again, kind of in the same line with BG equals primary. Note that in Bootstrap, instead of calling this blue or gray or green, we have these different Bootstrap statuses. So this first one is primary, which is the blue. Secondary is gray. Success is always green. Danger is red. Yellow is warning. All the way down through, we have all of these different statuses: info, light, and dark. So maybe we'll call our next card warning. We'll use the warning status for our background as we go back into our app. So we have BG color as our next argument. So we'll replace that primary status with our background color argument. And again, we can go back to our app. Let's call BG color equals warning, that yellow that we had just seen on the Bootstrap page. And we can rerun our app again. Awesome, we have that yellow card with our black font. That was all because of our first two arguments that we just created. So now we'll have access to this function anywhere in our app to much more quickly create these cards. If we want to create 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cards, it'll be a lot easier for us to do that. So maybe we can customize the final components, which would probably be the content of the app. Maybe the header text that we actually want to go there, the title text, and maybe the body text. So we'll add those three new arguments to our function. Let's call it header text, title text, and body text. We'll have to replace those within our function, and this is a lot easier because we just were able to quote those right here. So this will instead change to header text. We'll replace primary card title with title text because we want to say something other than primary card title. And instead of some quick example text, we'll replace that with our last argument, which would be the body text. What do we want in the body of our card? What do we want that to say? So we have header text, title text, and body text as our new three arguments. We can add those to our function over on the app.r script that we're working on. And we can change our header text to maybe Apsilon Conf 2022. We can change our title text to check it out. And how about our body text to say, we just built an awesome Bootstrap card in Shiny. If we rerun this, we've got our card that says Apsilon Conf 2022 as the header. Our title text is checking out, and our we just built an awesome Bootstrap card in Shiny text right here in the body of our card. So I hope you enjoyed learning how to create a custom Bootstrap card element in native Shiny and learned a little bit more about the relationship between Shiny and HTML. We will provide the link to the GitHub repository accompanying this tutorial either in the chat or the tutorial notes on the conference website. But also, please feel free to reach out to me directly if you have any additional questions. We hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you so much.
What an informative video. It was very easy to follow, and I loved the way that Michael explained everything in detail, step by step. Now you can build your custom UI that your user always asks for. Yay! You'll be able to find this tutorial in the video later in the Shiny Apps Gallery. Check it out later. Thank you.